Hi, folks. How are you? Hey, Terry. Hi, Bonnie. Hi, Dolores. Hi, Kate. Hi, Greg Mallard. Hey, Rick. How are you? Yeah, we hope you're well too, Rick. Did you all hear a Georgia state rep was arrested today? No. What was he arrested for, Greg? Carmen says, hi. Fresh out of fascist book jail, I hope. So do I, Carmen. So do I. Glad to see you back. So, I had some quick things I wanted to cover in the way of news. Then I want to get right to talking about the filibuster and the war on the post office. Glad you're well, Rick. Glad you've been busy. That's probably very good. Greg says she was arrested over protesting the Georgia GOP's horrendous voter suppression bill. Carmen says, thanks, Dr. Joe. Missed you bunches. Thank you, Carmen. So, first, I thought it was noteworthy that Rashida Tlaib and Pramila Jayapal unveiled, reintroduced the Automatic Booster Communities Act again to provide 2,000 monthly payments to everyone for the duration of the crisis and $1,000 a month for a year after the emergency ends in an effort to guarantee sustained relief for millions struggling to afford food, rent, and other basic expenses in the middle of the pandemic. And you remember that the ABC Act proposed financing the payments with an unconventional plan that would direct the Treasury Department to use its legal authority to mint as many $1 trillion platinum coins as necessary to fund the legislation, which would continue until a year after the public health emergency ends or the unemployment rate stabilizes at a low level. The idea of using the mint to cover government costs rose to prominence in 2011 during a fight over the debt ceiling and briefly emerged once again in 2013. Actually, that isn't really quite right. It did emerge in 2011 in a fight over the debt ceiling, but it emerged once again in 2012. And the period of its emergence in 2012 and the early part of 2013 was actually a bit longer than the period when it rose to prominence in 2011. In 2011, it rose to prominence. It didn't start. It started in January of 2011, but it didn't really begin to attract attention until the late part of June of 2011, and then it only lasted till about the 2nd of August 2011. Then it faded back into obscurity. As Matt O'Brien explained in The Atlantic at the time, federal law lets the Treasury trade coins in whatever value it wants, even $1 trillion. Well, I'm not going to go over that any further here because I just wanted to skip through 3 items very quickly, but I wanted you to know that the ABC Act in all its glory is back, and Jayapal and also Tlaib will be doing whatever they can to get a lot more co-sponsors onto it this time, and perhaps to benefit from those co-sponsors if certain other things happen which would make actually passing it with 51 votes a possibility. So I wanted to share that with you and highlight it a bit. Now I want to move on to a second quick news item. This one also covered by Jake Johnson, March 25th, 2021, in Common Dreams. And I thought some of you would be interested in this. I personally am interested in it. Trump holdovers accused of sabotaging the effort to get checks to 30 million Social Security recipients. And the article blamed the two Trump appointees, Andrew Saul and the other guy, I forget his first name. His last name, though, is Black. David Black. They were accused of sabotaging the Biden administration by holding back the database of updated SAA recipients, which the IRS needed to get a hold of so it could distribute payments to those recipients. Since Bonnie and I are among the eligible recipients, and we had not heard any news from anybody about the checks, we certainly were glad to see that public pressure was being exerted on these guys. And we heard, actually, just about an hour ago, there was an email, that appeared on my desk. And somebody was giving us the good news that the IRS now has the data from the Social Security Administration and will now be able to begin working on getting those checks or electronic payments out to people. So that was the second item of note I wanted to tell you about. The third item, also covered on March 21st by Common Dreams, this time by Jessica Corbett. What Jessica had to say is that the progressives in Congress commit to the Sunrise Movement $10 trillion, quote, good jobs for all pledge. And there's a little graphic of good jobs for all, I guess, produced by the Sunrise Movement. Yeah, the image was produced by the Sunrise Movement. They point out millions of Americans remain out of work, and climate campaigners express initial disappointment over Joe Biden's emerging infrastructure proposal. And the Sunrise Movement today, as on Thursday, officially launched its Good Jobs for All pledge with support from eight key progressives in Congress. The 8 key ones who immediately signed onto it were Senator Ed Markey, Democrat of Massachusetts, Senator Bernie Sanders, Democrat of Vermont, as well as Representatives Jamal Bowman, Brendan Boyle, Bonnie Watson Coleman of New Jersey. Brendan Boyle is from Pennsylvania, by the way. Jamal Bowman is from New York, of course. Adriano Espaillat, also of New York. Ayanna Pressley, Democrat of Massachusetts. And Rashida Tlaib. I'm sure coming shortly will be AOC, Ilhan Omar, and Marie Newman, and undoubtedly Jayapal will not be far behind. Senator Warren probably will not be far behind, and I suppose there will be 25 to 30 CPC people that will be taking this pledge, and maybe even more, because Barney Watson Coleman, okay, and Espelot are not people who they're sort of center left people, and Brendan Boyle too, kind of center left. So, and there'll probably be more senators signing on too, probably Jeff Merkley. I expect to see Debbie Dingell on that list, Jan Schakowsky, okay, a number of others. So we're probably looking at a number of people who are going to take that particular pledge. Sunrise had over a dozen partners: Communications Workers of America, Democracy for America, Indivisible, March for Our Lives, the NDN Collective, United We Dream, and the Working Families Party that joined with us in calling for Congresspeople to take the pledge, calling on federal elected officials to endorse the pledge. And there was a quote from Varshini Prakash: "We live in a moment of historic crises, a health crisis, an economic inequality crisis, a racial justice crisis, and a climate crisis that looms over it all," she said on Thursday. "With so much work to do building a better society that works for all of us," continuing her quote, "there's no reason anyone in the richest country in the history of the world should be unemployed, underemployed, or working a job that isn't in the public interest," unquote. And she went further: "That's why we're calling on every single member of Congress to take the Good Jobs for All pledge, demonstrating their commitment to enact policies that meet the scale of the crises we're facing and puts us on a path to a Green New Deal that guarantees a good job to anyone who wants one," she explained. And went further, quote, "We're going to put on the pressure to make sure that they do, and if they don't, well, then they're really going to hear from us. We take fighting for good jobs and a livable future seriously," unquote. And Ed Markey made a very nice statement, and Adriano Espelot also made a very nice statement. And the Sunrise Movement thanked them all for their pledges. And Presley, who's a Green New Deal co-sponsor, by the way, also introduced the job guarantee into Congress very recently, and quote, she said, "That's why I recently introduced a history-making resolution in Congress calling for a federal job guarantee, and it's why I'm proud to be among the first to sign the Good Jobs for All pledge," unquote. Congresswoman expressed excitement about advancing, quote, "bold employment policies that ensure every person has access to a good job that pays a living wage," unquote. And about putting people to work, quote, "addressing urgent priorities like the climate crisis." Sunrise Press Secretary Ellen Cialis and other critics of the developing proposal pointed out that even Senator Joe Manchin, a conservative Democrat from West Virginia, has called for at least $4 trillion in infrastructure spending. The advocacy group is also backing the Build Green Infrastructure and Jobs Act introduced last week by Ed Markey and Ocasio-Cortez, which we covered just yesterday. That's the $500 billion bill over 10 years in state, local, and tribal projects with the ultimate goal of a fully electric U.S. Public transportation system. By the way, I should not fail to point out that if the job guarantee is passed as well, say, as part of the infrastructure bill, then it's estimated that the initial expenditures on the job guarantee per year would probably work out to something like $650 billion per year. It would not average that, but might average something like $350 billion per year. So when you add this to the $500 billion over 10 years, $350 billion plus $50 billion a year is $400 billion a year, which is much more like what people need and a considerable way towards the 1 trillion per year in jobs that the Sunrise Movement was calling for. Was it? I'm sorry, 10 trillion good jobs for all pledge over 10 years, which is $1 trillion per year. So it's quite a ways towards that then, roughly $400 billion towards that. So just to keep these things in mind. So now, having covered the short news items, I want to get to the filibuster. I promised you yesterday some news on that. We'd be talking about some plans the Democrats have to really get movement going on the filibuster. I'll share this screen. Before I go into this article itself, though, I want to point out that news broke today that Angus King is talking about his own change of heart concerning the filibuster. He wrote an article for the Washington Post saying that basically when he first came to the Senate, he was all for getting rid of the filibuster. Then he got spoken to by lots of other Dems and who emphasized to him the danger of getting rid of the filibuster, because if the Democrats were to get rid of it, it might just be for a short spell of time, and the Republicans would come in and they wouldn't have the filibuster to contend with, and they'd get rid of all the safety net programs and everything. And so they scared him, and basically he became an opponent of getting rid of the filibuster. But now again, he's changing his mind because the Republicans themselves have in fact been following a scorched earth policy in relation to the use of the filibuster to block bills that are important and that are useful. And he indicated that he'll be watching very closely what they do, and that the fate of the filibuster will depend on what they do, or at least the fate of his opposition to the filibuster will depend on what the Republicans do. If they follow that scorched earth policy again, then it's going to have very negative consequences for the filibuster. So he's explicitly threatening to get rid of or severely limit the power of the filibuster if the Republicans follow a scorched earth policy of opposition to the programs which the Democrats would like to pass. That opposition is in line with this article, the headline of which is Senate Dems have a plan to showcase GOP's filibuster abuse. Biden's on board. And this piece was by Chris Walker of Truth Out, and it was put forward yesterday, March 24th. And it says, Democrats intend to test Republicans in the coming weeks by showcasing the need to end the Senate filibuster. They plan to put a number of popular legislative items up for a vote to see whether GOP lawmakers will simply obstruct every bill. With several bills passing the House, the majority leader of the Senate, Chuck Schumer, has promised to put them up for a vote in the upper chamber of Congress. Doing so would likely set up a number of legislative battles, including the use of the filibuster by Republican lawmakers, which will require those bills to have at least 60 votes in the Senate, meaning the support of at least 10 GOP senators in order to pass. Of course, Trump is going to figure in this too, because when H.R. 1 and H.R. 4 get put forward to block voter suppression and gerrymandering, I guess it's going to be S1. It is S1 already, probably going to be S4, in the Senate. But when those bills come forward, Trump is probably going to say that any Republican senators who dare to join with the Democrats in favor of these bills will be primaried by a Trumpist. You know he's going to make that kind of threat because that's just the way he rolls. Just the way he rolls. He's going to threaten to chop off their heads. Okay. So there ain't going to be 60 votes in the Senate. They're going to be squeezed between Trump and the threat of losing the filibuster entirely. They won't know what to do. They won't know where to go. But in the end, they're going to have to bow to McConnell. The only chance for them to save the filibuster is for McConnell to decide he's not going to go scorched earth and instead to work for compromise, okay, with the Democrats in opposition to Trump. And then, of course, Trump is going to rage and he's going to work as hard as he can to defeat any senators who go with McConnell rather than he says it's going to be a knockdown, drag-out fight for control of the Republican Party in the Senate, which should be fun to watch. Anyway, Democrats plan to use Republican obstruction to their advantage to showcase the need for filibuster reform or even possibly to remove the Senate rule altogether. Democrats in the Senate will likely put forward bills that every member of their caucus can get behind. If the bills get blocked, it could demonstrate to the American public and legislators who are wary of reform alike that the filibuster is being used by Republicans purely for political reasons. Democrats can then seize the opportunity to justify ending the archaic rule or at least changing it in some way. Democrats aren't necessarily being coy with this strategy. Quote, what I'm saying to those who defend the filibuster is show me the Senate can operate with a filibuster and still do things that make us a better nation, unquote, said Dick Durbin, Senator Dick Durbin recently told his Republican colleagues on the Senate floor. The plan probably won't go into effect for a while, however, as the Senate is scheduled to go on a 2-week recess starting on Thursday. That was today, of course. Still, the idea of putting bills up for a vote and then forcing Republicans to decide what's in their best interest regarding the filibuster demonstrates how Democrats are thinking strategically with regards to getting their agenda passed before the next elections, before the midterms. There will still be obstacles to reforming or removing the filibuster, primarily from two centrist Democrats, Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who have voiced opposition to ending the rule. But of course, as you know, there have been movements on this front, and we will hear more about that. There have been signs lately that even they may be open to changing the rule. Manchin, for instance, has recently stated he would be in favor of imposing rules on the filibuster that would force senators to actually stand on the floor of the Senate and speak. Such a, quote, standing filibuster, unquote, has also received support from President Joe Biden, who has also expressed worries about doing away with the filibuster altogether. However, Biden may also be shifting his position on the matter and leaning toward ending the filibuster altogether, according to reporting from Axios, which we went over yesterday, by the way. Biden recently met with a number of historians at the White House, and they talked about time to go for a big and fast agenda, even if that means removing the Senate rule. Also, people close to Biden who spoke to Axios on the matter said that he is wanting to do more as president and is prepared to support ending the filibuster. It means he and Democrats can pass multiple items from his legislative agenda into law. And so that's that piece, promising with respect to the filibuster. But here's more from Dave Dayen today. Dave Day in his first 100 column. The president, the Manchin's agenda. This picture of Joe Manchin talking to reporters about things he wants done. This was done today, this column, on March 25th. And Dave starts off with moderate members of Congress who represent the margin of victory when it comes to legislation always get outsized attention. You might say that's why they're moderates. Nobody's hanging on to Senator Blumenthal's every word, after all, though they should, because Blumenthal is an underrated lawmaker. But I digress, says Dave, and I digress too. But the combination of an extremely narrow majority in the Senate and pent-up demand for liberal policies has forced us to peer entirely too deeply into the mind of Joe Manchin, Democrat of West Virginia, and it's a pretty confusing place. Manchin has kind of a shtick on big bills. There he stakes out a very rigid position, calls for bipartisanship around it, and then signs on to the Democratic position once he wins something or other. That thing can be harmless or even something laudatory. On the American Rescue Plan, it was the Butch-Lewis Act, the $86 billion multi-employer pension rescue, which was a priority of a lot of the caucus, but was Manchin's bill for years. But it was also the cutback of $100 a week on the federal unemployment enhancement in exchange for one additional week of coverage, and the rapid narrowing of the phase-out on direct payments. There was no economic or even political case for this other than for Manchin to say he changed the law. Why would he want to claim he changed the law for the worse? I don't know. Now we're seeing this play out on additional parts of the Democratic agenda. 2 weeks ago, Manchin said Republicans had to be included in any infrastructure bill in order to win his vote. This would threaten to sink the entire project. Then yesterday he said that the package would be huge, as much as $4 trillion, which of course is above the $3 trillion plan Biden will reportedly roll out next week. But I don't really think that's what Biden is going to roll out next week. I think that was just a trial balloon. I think he's intending to roll out something larger, more like $4 trillion or so. And that he was just rolling out the trial balloon at $3 trillion. That it should be paid for by raising taxes on corporations and the wealthy, something no Republican would ever agree to. Pressed on that fundamental distinction, Manchin said Republican intransigence was not, quote, reasonable, unquote, asking, quote, where do they think it's going to come from? Platinum coins, Joe Manchin, platinum coins. Asking, where do they think it's going to come from? How are you going to fix America, unquote. This suggests that Manchin knows well that infrastructure will only happen through the reconciliation process, and that, quote, including, unquote, Republicans means allowing them to reject tax increases before finding a way around them. This increases the chances of success over the too cute White House theory that you could pass the pieces that Republicans like through a regular bill and throw everything else into reconciliation, hoping that the opposition just plays along. Dave says, I don't know that every dollar needs to be offset on this bill. I don't know that either. I don't think it does. But we're talking about someone in Manchin who gets a call from staff daily updating him on the precise national debt figure. So that's where we are. Oh boy, does this guy need to learn MMT? Does he need to learn MMT? He really needs that. Somebody's got to get to him. There's got to be somebody he might consider persona grata. Of course, the mansion is making a lot of announcements these days because literally every item on the agenda is subservient to disagreement. As I noted yesterday, he's against anything even 2 inches to the left of the background check bill he couldn't pass in 2013, making progress on gun safety so remote that the Biden team is dipping into executive orders to see what can be done. Dave says, I'm big on executive action, as you know, but guns are an area where you need to legislate. He was among those taking down the $15 minimum wage bill, although his plan to get to $11 rapidly and then index to inflation shares similarities with the long phase-in for $15. Bernie Sanders apparently rejected this in a meeting this week, which I think wasn't smart, says Dave. I think that wasn't smart either, because the index, according to Kirsten Sinema, she believes the indexing would bring it to $15 an hour by 2024. And that's a year earlier than the bill that the progressives wanted to pass as part of the reconciliation bill, which would have reached $15 an hour only by 2025. So no, I don't think that was smart, if it is true that Bernie apparently rejected this in a meeting last week. Wait, there's more, says Dave. The Manchin opined on S1, the democracy bill that includes independent redistricting and voter participation standards and more public financing of elections, which got its first Senate hearing yesterday. He said that any bill on voting would need bipartisan support, quote, to be accepted as legitimate by U.S. voters, unquote. This essentially gives voter-suppressing conservatives a veto over ending their own suppression. Chuck Schumer also told labor groups this week that they need to find 50 co-sponsors for the PRO Act, a welcome change to labor law that would eliminate right-to-work laws and punish the union busting in order for them to get a floor vote. Guess who's one of the 5 Democrats not signed on to the PRO Act? Joe Manchin. I'll add here that Manchin did save the job of Colin Kahl, nominated, I think it's pronounced Kale actually, nominated for a chief policy position at the Defense Department. Manchin voted for Kahl in committee, making it likely that he'd be confirmed. Manchin has played kingmaker on all controversial nominations, taking down near a tandem, but mostly letting Biden's choices through. Manchin is right now leading a group of 20 senators charged with showing that the Senate can work under the current rules. Another way of saying that is that Manchin is leading a group that's opposed to actually having majority rule in the Senate and desperate to find a fig leaf to keep it at bay. Manchin has said that the filibuster rule enables cooperation, quote unquote. If by that you mean cooperating on not doing much of anything, sure, Manchin desperately wants common ground where none is to be found. But he's still a West Virginia senator, and he'll take money to build the Joe Manchin suspension bridge, just not the Joe Manchin Independent Redistricting Commission. So I thought that was very important to call to your attention. What it means is Joe Manchin is moving. There are things that can help to move Joe Manchin. Biden's optimistic talking these days is probably there because he knows that Manchin can be moved. He's been reading the signals. He probably also knows that Sinema can be moved. So, also what Schumer is doing in the Senate to put pressure on the Democratic opponents to reform or elimination of the filibuster is probably key. I think there's nothing like showing people the lengths the GOP will go through, which would happen in April, to get the filibuster to block bill after bill after bill. That is really going to dramatically illustrate how the filibuster can paralyze the Senate. The only downside of that is the Democrats will have to make clear why in previous years when they had full control of the Senate, and remember, they had full control of the Senate right up until 2015. You wonder why during those years when they had control of the Senate, they didn't demonstrate for people how bill after bill after bill was being paralyzed by a talking filibuster. I mean, why didn't they pull that then? Who knows? Maybe Obama could have gotten through another stimulus bill. Maybe he could have gotten through a public option if he'd wanted one, of course. There was no evidence that he really wanted one, and every bit of evidence that he did, that was simply kabuki. But anyway, you get the picture. Why didn't they pull this when they had full control in 2009, 2010, and partial control of the Senate, control of the presidency during 4 more years of Obama's term? Anyway, things are looking more optimistic with respect to taking the filibuster down. We have to see what's going to happen, but at this point, it looks like the Democrats are beginning to fight. Now we'll see how hard they fight and over what they fight and how much hardball they are willing to play. We should, of course, be supporting whatever hardball they exhibit. We should be supporting that. So, now we get to the post office. Now we get to the post office and Louis DeJoy. But first, I want to get to a piece called The War Against the Postal Service, done at the Economic Policy Institute by Monique Morrissey on December 16, 2020. It's entitled The War Against the Postal Service. I'm not going to go through it all. This is a very, very long report, and I'm going to leave it to you to read the whole report. It's very interesting and a very good piece of work. Would have been better if it had been written from an MMT point of view, of course, but it is a good piece of work in spite of that. Anyway, I'm going to go through a part of it for you. Introduction. The Postal Service is many things. For example, a public service, part of the nation's critical infrastructure. It's a regulated monopoly, a good employer, especially for black workers, and for military veterans, and for immigrants, as well. If you go to a post office here, okay, in the Washington area, you can't miss the presence, okay, of immigrants employed by the post office. Very, very common in the Washington, D.C. area. And a government enterprise competing with and supplying services to private companies. To take advantage of network economies, the United States and other countries shield their postal services from competition in exchange for delivering mail to far-flung and poorer regions, like transportation and communication networks that are often publicly owned or function as utilities regulated by the government. A national service with standardized pricing promotes commerce and guards against the concentration of economic power. That brings us to the social value of the post office. Social value of the Postal Service extends beyond the economic benefits provided by delivery operations. It connects family and friends, fosters democracy, and is a key part of our emergency and national security infrastructure. It is operated without interruption during the COVID-19 pandemic and other national catastrophes. Without interruption, but not without delays during the pandemic, thanks to the fabulous Louis. Career jobs in the Postal Service are good jobs for workers without bachelor's degrees. Postal workers are better compensated than many other workers with similar levels of education, years of experience, and hours worked. This is typical for unionized workers, workers employed by large employers, and public sector workers without degrees, bachelor's degrees. However, this advantage is shrinking as the Postal Service increasingly relies on non-career employees who receive rather meager benefits, and there is pressure to cut benefits for career employees as well. Here are some challenges of the Postal Service. Postal Service's financial woes, exacerbated by the pandemic, are due to a confluence of factors. A mail monopoly that is declining in value with the rise of electronic communication. A public service mandate to deliver to every address in the country 6 days a week. Caps on postal rates, borrowing limits, and other restrictions that limit its ability to raise revenue and make necessary investments, and an onerous requirement to rapidly pre-fund retiree benefits, okay, among other factors. Why does it have to raise revenue? Be so concerned about raising revenue? Of course, because it's no longer directly a part of the government, but living off the congressional budget. That's why it has problems. It's no longer a cabinet-level department as it once was. President Trump's push to privatize the Postal Service and his party's antipathy toward government partly explain Republicans' reluctance to provide the same pandemic relief to the Postal Service as it has to airlines and other private companies facing a similar collapse in demand for their services. Yes, we gave all kinds of aid to private companies and very little to the post office, and it was like pulling teeth. Privatization is a long-standing goal of conservative think tanks and corporations that stand to gain from weakening or dismantling the Postal Service. The administration has also been motivated by the president's animus. You have to recall when this was written, Trump was still president, toward Amazon, a major Postal Service customer, and a desire to impede voting by mail, which of course we all know about. With politics and ideology, while politics and ideology play a role in privatization efforts, the driving force is special interests. Large corporations such as UPS, FedEx, and Pitney Bowes that seek to take advantage of the same network and scale economies of the Postal Service to capture an even larger share of the shipping and mail processing markets without shouldering the Postal Service's public service responsibilities. These corporations not only lobby Congress and the Postal Regulatory Commission, but also exert an unusual amount of influence through industry advisory groups that operate behind closed doors. The public service is restricted in its ability to enter new markets, which is a restriction that benefits competitors but not consumers. In particular, the financial services industry has an interest in preventing the Postal Service from reviving postal banking, which would greatly benefit unbanked and underbanked communities that currently rely on high-cost payday lenders and other alternative financial services. Meanwhile, the Postal Service is being hollowed out by outsourcing and constrained in its ability to compete in parcel delivery, with negative effects on consumers and workers. Laws designed to prevent government agencies from lowering labor standards by outsourcing to low-wage companies do not apply to bulk mailers and other companies that perform processing and transportation tasks that would otherwise be done by the Postal Service and receive deep discounts in exchange. Postal Service itself does not benefit from these work share, quote unquote, types of arrangements because the cost savings are fully passed on to the companies, many of which are competitive only because they pay low wages. The new Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy, previously headed a logistics company that performed outsourced postal work and engaged in illegal anti-union activities. Interesting, huh? This will play into something we'll go into later. Here are policy recommendations. Allowing the Postal Service to fail or speeding up the privatization process already underway would harm the national economy while devastating many vulnerable households and communities, notably homebound seniors, people in people in rural areas, and residents of low-income urban neighborhoods. The corporations that stand to gain will do so not because they're more efficient than the Postal Service, but because they can shed public service obligations and pay their workers less. Public policy needs to address market concentration and low-road labor practices in the e-commerce, shipping, and related industries. Amazon should be regulated, not arbitrarily forced to pay 4 times what it is currently paying the Postal Service for deliveries, as President Trump has demanded. Increasing what Amazon pays for deliveries would primarily benefit UPS and other competitors, not consumers, workers, small businesses, or the Postal Service itself. The Postal Service and corporations that interact with it have a significant degree of market power, though the Postal Service is limited in its ability to exercise this power by the Postal Regulatory Commission. Rather than treating the sector as if it were a competitive market and blocking the Postal Service from entering new markets, policymakers should focus on ensuring that the Postal Service fulfills its public service mission in the face of changing needs and market conditions. So I'm not going to go through the rest of it, but I'm just going to point out some of the subtitles to you to give an indication of what's available here. If you're looking for talking points and ways of defending the post office. Now, the Postal Service is good for communities, and it goes on to list the benefits, of a postal service being a monopoly. It has a section on the post office, but providing an important public service in various areas, as a voting by mail section on postal banking, which is of great interest. The Postal Service also provides good jobs. That was mentioned, but there's detail in it, okay, in the report. That's important. The report also goes into challenges and constraints faced by the Postal Service, like the pandemic. The Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act also provides some constraints on the post office. Of course, the retiree health benefits are absolutely notorious for the pre-funding that is actually required. The funding 75 years in advance. That requirement is utterly ridiculous. Anyway, there's a fairly long discussion of that. A discussion of caps on postage rates, constraints on competitive services that beset the post office, the role of special interests, and the push to privatize the postal service, hollowing out the postal service through outsourcing of the postal service, limiting the postal service's ability to compete when it comes to delivering the parcels. There are limitations on that now, which of course hurt the business position of the Postal Service. Then there's the role of ideology and special interests, specifically the pro-privatization think tanks. And there was the specific Trump-era assaults on the Postal Service, which hopefully will be ending now. Those are covered, okay, in the report. And then finally, the appointment of Louis DeJoy and his activities, his opposition to unions, the Republican Party's own efforts in opposition to the interests of their constituents, and then a section on looking to the future of the post office. So the report is pretty complete, and I recommend it to you. Next, an extremely relevant post appeared from Ryan Cooper in The Week, and I'll share that. It's extremely relevant because it is in the nature of advice how to oust by Louis DeJoy, a guide for nervous presidents. This was published today. The Post Office used to be one of the best run and most popular agencies in the American government. But under the leadership of Postmaster General Louis DeJoy, on-time delivery has plummeted, wreaking havoc on both individuals and businesses. Now he is proposing sweeping changes that will make service both worse and much more expensive. This is supposedly meant to address a substantial operating deficit, but it could very easily lead to a death spiral, as the worse service causes customers to flee to private shippers, cutting revenue further. That may even be intentional, as John Nichols argues in his article at the Nation. It all smells like the start of a plan for privatizing the agency entirely. President Biden must get rid of DeJoy and replace him with someone who can undo the damage to the post office. Doing so won't be as simple as firing a cabinet secretary, but it is a matter of vital public interest. Indeed, given the millions of prescription medications that the agency delivers every day, it is a matter of life and death. Let me start with the legal background. The president is not allowed to simply fire the Postmaster General, who was appointed by the USPS Board of Governors. There are currently 3 vacancies on the board, as Biden's nominees have not yet been confirmed. But pursuant to Article 39 of the U.S. Code, Section 202, there's a paragraph 202, he can fire members of the board, quote, for cause, unquote. And the board can fire the Postmaster General. In general, it's hard to think of a better cause for termination than appointing someone to lead an agency who proceeds to wreck the agency. But specifically, the sentence about cause reads as follows, quote, the governors shall not be representative of specific interests using the Postal Service and may be removed only for cause, unquote. A later section says that the Postmaster General, quote, shall be a voting member of the board, unquote. Wouldn't you know it, DeJoy, a longtime Trump friend and fundraiser, had a giant conflict of interest that directly violated this requirement. According to financial disclosure reports, he had a stake in XPO Logistics valued at between $30 million and $75 million when he took office. XPO Logistics is a company that not only has historically done a ton of business with the post office, but also saw its contracts with the agency roughly triple in size compared to previous years. Immediately after he became the Postmaster General. Now, DeJoy did apparently divest his stake in XPO Logistics in October by giving it to his adult children. But as Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington explains, this looks very much like a sham divestment because nothing is stopping his children from giving the assets right back to him later. And by the way, isn't that exactly the same thing Trump did when he came into the presidency? I don't even know if he divested himself. I think in his case, he just supposedly gave control over to his children, if I'm not mistaken. But even if I am, and if he gave them the assets, of course, nothing is stopping them from giving back the assets now. Afterwards, the company continued to be awarded large post office contracts. No conflict of interest there. His family members have vital interests in that company, and they're continuing to get post office contracts while he's the Postmaster General. No conflict of interest there. Somehow, I think there is. There's certainly the appearance of conflict of interest, which is enough to get him fired, according to federal government rules. In any case, one does not get a free pass on an instance of corruption just because one stopped doing it. This story would seem to suggest that Biden could remove DeJoy from the board, thereby rendering him ineligible to serve as Postmaster General. And it surely implies on its face that the president can remove other board members for ignoring this blatant self-dealing. This isn't just some legal technicality either. The head of an agency awarding big contracts to a company in which he has a massive personal stake is basically the dictionary definition of corruption. Public officials are supposed to represent the public interest, which is the entire point of stipulating that members of the board aren't allowed to have business relating to the post office in the first place. DeJoy was stuffing his own pockets with public money for at least several months. Indeed, DeJoy's conflict also might violate federal anti-corruption law. He supposedly got his XPO logistics stake cleared by federal ethics officials, but that happened under Trump and was therefore likely not above board. At a minimum, the Attorney General would be wholly justified in opening an investigation. If Biden did fire the Trump appointees on the Board of Governors, they would likely sue and might get the decision stayed by federal courts. But then again, the Supreme Court ruled a couple of years ago that Trump was allowed to sack the head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in open defiance of a, quote, for cause, unquote, protection clause, despite what some legal experts argue, whether Biden is, quote, legally, unquote, allowed to sack board members will ultimately turn on how big of hypocrites the conservatives on the court are willing to be when they are inventing law out of whole cloth. They may not be that hypocritical. Some of them are smart about public appearances, like John Roberts. And I have a feeling Amy Coney Barrett can be pretty cagey when she wants to be also. More broadly, Alex Perrine argues at the New Republic. Democrats in Congress could play a role here as well. Congress wrote the law setting up the agency's current structure, and it could change it at any time if Democrats reform the filibuster. This would be a good opportunity to modernize the post office, which is badly needed. And by the way, speaking of infrastructure, in West Virginia, which might have something to do with expanding local post office, with expanding post offices in local areas, with the justification being that they're now offering postal banking, that might result in a lot more local post offices in West Virginia, and might have an impact on the way Joe Manchin goes on the filibuster. This would be a good opportunity, just my commentary, this would be a good opportunity to modernize the post office, which is badly needed. They could also hold hearings. I mean, there could be a lot of Joe Manchin post offices in West Virginia, as well as the Joe Manchin suspension bridge, as well as the Joe Manchin railroad between Washington and Charlestown. What about that? This would be a good opportunity to modernize the post office, which is badly needed. They could also hold hearings, dragging DeJoy up to answer about why he is giving a company he partly owns so much money and why the agency is in such dire straits. If the Trump administration proved anything, it is that a determined president can accomplish a lot. As is noted by Perrine, he trampled over existing legal precedent, kept acting officials in their posts in violation of the law, casually ignored the emoluments clause of the Constitution, and on and on. It would almost certainly be possible to chase DeJoy out of office with some combination of investigation, board confirmations and replacements, and public pressure without even coming close to breaking the law as Trump did. It appears unlikely that DeJoy will be removed, even if Biden's three nominees are all confirmed. That would give the Democrats on the court a majority, but as Dave Dayen points out at the American Prospect, the two existing Democrats on it but Chairman Ron Bloom and Donald Mullick, who were both appointed by Trump, have signed on in support of DeJoy's plan. If Americans are to have the same quality of mail service that we enjoyed as recently as 2019, President Biden is going to have to take action. Well, I think Ryan Cooper has pretty well laid out a roadmap for getting rid of DeJoy. What's Joe Biden waiting for? What's he waiting for? Why doesn't he start moving now while the Senate is in session? Why doesn't he have a talk with Merrick Garland? Right now. Get going. Time's a wasting. We need this guy out of there before he ruins the post office. We need that very, very badly. So, we have the post office situation with maybe some movement on that. We have the filibuster situation with maybe some movement on that. Apropos of this is a comment made today by Jordan Pacharitan. Not sure it was, but today it was a video I was looking at today. I'm not sure the date. It might have been a few days ago. I can't remember whether he did it in one of today's videos or whether it was a clip from the Kshama Sawant interview a few days ago. But anyway, he stated, it's not all about the filibuster. He said the filibuster isn't really the issue because if the filibuster were to go tomorrow, it's not like everything would just be hunky-dory and all these wonderful bills would suddenly all slide through and make everything great. Well, I think Jordan's heart is in the right place on this, but he's missing the point, which is the difference between a necessary condition and sufficient conditions for getting bills passed. Getting rid of the filibuster is not a sufficient condition for getting H.R. 1, H.R. 4, infrastructure, the Medicare for All bill, the minimum wage bill. Getting rid of the filibuster is not a sufficient condition for getting any of those things passed. But it is a necessary condition, because if you don't get rid of the filibuster, none of those things can be passed. You must get rid of the filibuster or modify it significantly so it no longer stands in the way. So, Jordan, please note there's a difference between a necessary condition and sufficient conditions in causation. And you need to distinguish between both of those things. So now on to your comments. Kay says, I just saw that, Greg. I think Kay saw the arrest in Georgia. And Lana says, Passover greetings in order. Well, they're always in order, but you know me, Lana, I'm kind of secular. Okay, and Bonnie is kind of secular too. Maybe not as secular as I am, but it's sort of like if we're going to do seders and things like that, okay, it's up to me. And
If you cook.
yeah, not only because I cook, but it's also up to me because I run the Seders. So, and it's been quite a few years, actually, since the kids were kids, that I've done anything like that. Nor do I generally go to other people's Seders. I'm usually too busy. So Greg Mollett says, she was manhandled by at least 4 Georgia State police officers at the state capitol. Kay says, shared. And Terry says, welcome back, Carmen. I've been there a few times myself. As a matter of fact, I'm doing a little protest from 4-1 until 4-8 by staying off completely. So far, I have 8 people going along with me. Terry says, corporations, quote, corporations suffer huge loss at the Supreme Court as justices unanimously make it easier to sue over defective and dangerous products. Wow, isn't that a surprise? That is a very nice surprise. Kay says, yep, Biden needs to get rid of those guys. No checks for me yet. Greg says, every Trump appointee should be fired immediately. Gregory says, sounds a lot like FJG to me. Well, Presley's bill is an FJG, yes, yes. And it was passed with consultation from Pavlina, if I am not mistaken. Okay, I mean, I think MMTers are starting to have some influence in Congress now, for sure. Not just with AOC, Ayanna, Rashida. There are a lot more people who've been taking instruction on the progressive side, learning about the basics, okay, of MMT. We are in the Congress now. We are a factor, even though it's still quite sub rosa. Gregory says Raphael Warnock may take that pledge as well. I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised. I think that Raphael Warnock is a sleeper candidate for the progressives. It wouldn't take much for him to openly come out as not so very centrist after all. I don't have similar hopes, okay, for Ossoff, but who knows. Kay says, I used to belong to CWA years ago. Communication Workers of America. And Gregory Ballard says, I work with Indivisible here in Georgia. Yes, Indivisible has a very good campaign going to get rid of the filibuster. Carmen says, fantastic, I'll join you, but I'll come to this live stream to share an invite. It's just too important to side pass. So count me as number 9, solidarity. Terry Burke. Carmen Muniz, awesome. Thanks. That made my night. Gregory Malice says, the filibuster must be abolished. Oh, God, I hope so. Carmen says, invites and group shares accomplished. Kay says, Evelina Pont, where are you? Kay's always asking where Evelina is. Carmen says, quote, Trump's secret sit-down with Ohio candidates turns into Hunger Games, unquote. To read it on the web, tap here. Share Smart News. Kay says, I saw that, laugh out loud. Kay says, I watched the great live streaming today on fair districting in Ohio. We need it badly. Kay says, maybe we could finally get rid of Jim Jordan, laugh out loud. That would be wonderful, right? Ghost Start says, oops, a little late. I was watching Steve G on Generational Change. Where's everyone at? Arby's? Ghost Start says, shared. Terry Burke says, quote, The Missouri Republican offers shocking rationalization for overturning the will of the voters here. Yeah, they're always so shocking. They're always saying the quiet part out loud. Carmen Yunus says, we'll read afterwards. Lana says, I was watching Fadl Kaboub. He went off about 10 minutes or so before Dr. Joe started his broadcast. Carmen says, only 9 watching. I just invited my ass off. Thank you, Carmen. Terry says, stream keeps breaking up for me. Carmen says, having problems here too. Lana says, the Joe Manchin Bridge. I can't. Ha ha. But glad if he is moving. Will he try to sell us the bridge? Well, he's moving to try to get us to build that Joe Manchin Bridge. Ghost Start says, Georgia State Patrol arrested Democratic Representative Park Cannon outside an entrance to the Kemp governor's office, where she was peacefully protesting a voter suppression bill being signed into law. Kay says, we need postal banking too. Lana says, yikes, re-rep Park Cannon. Carmen says, the joy is a killjoy. Ghost Start says, I don't have a Zoom account yet. Couldn't find Fadl anywhere else. You don't have to have a Zoom account. All you have to do is get a link to the Zoom. If there's a link to the Zoom, you click on that and you join it. You don't have to have a Zoom account. Carmen says, the Joy just wants to sabotage voting by mail in every way possible. Lana says, I added Zoom to my phone as an app. It's not difficult. I don't think there's a charge. Carmen says, we should have called Bernie's platform the Pony Express. Terry Burke says, guys, we'll catch up another time, having Wi-Fi issues. I think someone is riding my Wi-Fi. Carmen says, okay, I understand. Garstad says, despite reality, McConnell says filibuster has no racial history. Boy, that McConnell, his ability to lie with a straight face is just incredible. I mean, the filibuster was invented, practically invented anyway, by John C. Calhoun. By John C. Calhoun, the biggest defender of slavery during the period he was in Congress. Kay says, privatization is a dirty word. Kay says, I love these discussions. So nice to be with like-minded people. Thank you all. Kay says, why doesn't he remove the rump guys in SSA? I don't know. I can only conclude there are things he has not gotten around to because his capacity to work long hours may be limited at his age. I'm not saying he's less capable of work than Trump was, because Trump was notorious for sitting in front of the television hours and never doing any work. But there may be also many little details that he can't get on top of because there are not enough hours in his day. And maybe he should delegate some decisions to Joe. Carmen says, Ryan Cooper Slade, Biden won't do anything because the Democrats are corrupt and the Republicans got him by the nuts. I don't see how that relates to getting rid of the joy and getting rid of those Social Security nincompoops either. I mean, he can appoint people who are Democrats and who are corrupt. Maybe not equally corrupt, but probably corrupt enough for Biden. Go Start says. Kamala Harris touting girls' empowerment with Bill Clinton as a bad joke. Yeah, I know. I can't believe their lack of sensitivity to that. I can't believe how clueless those people are. Lana says, we will hope the COVID Passover continues, but I wanted to mention it at least. Well, thank you, Lana. The COVID Passover has kind of continued for us, even though Passover wasn't here. That is, we took our second shot on February 12th. We're now way past the continued vulnerability period. The other day, a chiropractor mentioned saying with the number of days since we've had our second shot, probably the Moderna vaccine is now 98% effective, not just 95% effective. Lana says, how is Carmen? Carmen is here. Carmen is here. Carmen has been let out of jail. Carmen says, turtles only have one expression, therefore the straight face. Lana says, I heard Biden's press conference was a mess. Did anyone watch it? Well, Jordan Sheraton thought it was a big mess, but other outlets are writing it up in terms of the very good job that Biden did. I don't know which other outlets. I just saw one or two news items about it that were probably written by centrists. Anyway, the centrists are writing it up as a big success, that he handled it perfectly. And Russ says, shame that YT chat doesn't have an emoji selection. YT, Young Turks chat. Case says, still no J&J shot here in Canton, Ohio. Shake my head. Russ said, I just had first dose of Moderna last week. I get number 2 in April. Yes, you have to wait, I think, 28 days or 21 days, I think. Something like that. We took our first one in the middle of January sometime and had our second one February 12th. Carmen says, hi, Lana. Kay says, Jordan Sheraton has been depressing lately. Russ said, YouTube. Oh, sorry. Yeah, YouTube chat just doesn't have the emoji selection, unfortunately. Good to see you, though, Russ. Kay says, Jordan Sheraton has been depressing lately. Well, Jordan's down because he's getting tremendously repressed when it comes to YouTube attendance. And I think it's really been hurting them financially as well. Evidently, YouTube has been clamping down on all kinds of people. I have no idea whether it's clamping down on me because my attendance on YouTube is always so low anyway. That is very hard to tell if they're suppressing it or not. Carmen says, I got out of jail a couple of hours ago and had another violation meme waiting on me. I contested it and won. Russ says, good to see you, Dr. Joe. Thank you, Russ. It's great to see you, too. Okay, I guess I'm at the end of your comments. If you want to ask me anything else.
I may be wrong, but I thought I heard there was something about Biden using the silver coin for the post office.
The platinum coin, you mean?
Yeah.
But Bonnie says she heard something about Biden using the platinum coin
Maybe.
to fund the post office. But I thought I made a suggestion like that. But anyway, Uh, whoever made that suggestion, uh, it's great. Carmen says, Aldi peanut chocolate cookies making me COVID fat. Kay says, I used to watch Chariton a lot. Yeah, I still kind of check in on Jordan frequently. And Russ says, good to see you too, Dr. Joe. Thanks again, Russ. I also check in frequently on the Bree Joy Virgil Texas thing. I like their chatting. It's fun. Uh, and one thing puzzles me though. I don't want know. Okay, when people talk about what happened with respect to um, 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 the throwing, uh, um, um, the provision on the minimum wage out of the reconciliation bill. You often hear people wondering why the House Democrats did not use their power to block the bill. And yeah, that's something. Yeah, that's something. That also made me wonder, why doesn't the House insist? In other words, why don't they communicate with when Nancy Pelosi sends a bill over to the House? Why doesn't she send a message along with it saying that if this bill does not receive a floor vote in the Senate before getting amended, we will call for an automatic Senate House conference before passing it. That's going to be a House rule from now on. What would that do? It would force the Senate to give every bill passed by the House a floor vote. Force them to do that on penalty of having to have a formal House Senate conference at the end, which they often do not want to do. Why would that be important? Because look what happened to the reconciliation bill. The House passed it. Okay, it got to the Senate. And Chuck Schumer, before putting the bill on the floor and starting the voting process, he amended the bill to throw the minimum wage provision out of it, using his own authority. He didn't even refer the bill to committee. He just did it himself with his own staff. So the House bill, as is, never got a vote in the Senate. And the consequence of that was that Bernie had to put up an amendment which would have required 60 votes to get the minimum wage provision back into the bill. Okay, and Bree Joy noted that very plainly today, that that's what happened. Instead of having to get 51 votes to override the ruling of a parliamentarian, it was necessary to get 60 votes to get that back into the bill. And she was right about that. But what I wondered about is, why didn't she mention that when Chuck Schumer said to Bernie Sanders, because he had to have told Bernie this, so when he said to Bernie Sanders, I'm going to amend this bill and take the minimum wage provision out of it, because I don't want to embarrass Joe Biden and cause him to tell Kamala Harris to vote in favor of the parliamentarian, to uphold, okay, the parliamentarian. Why didn't Bernie say to Chuck Schumer at that time, if you do that, I'm going to vote against this bill. It's a condition of mine that the minimum wage, $15 an hour provision, stay in this bill. And I am not going to compromise on that. I've compromised on the amount, okay, of unemployment insurance. I'm willing to compromise on the eligibility criteria for the stimulus bill to please Joe Manchin. But I'm not here to make all the compromises. And I am not compromising on the minimum wage provision. That has to be in there, or we, the Progressive Caucus, including both myself and the House Democrats, will not vote for this bill. So without the minimum wage provision in it, cannot pass the Senate, it cannot pass the House. So Chuck, you go back to Joe Biden and you tell him he's going to have to make a decision, okay, about whether he wants to pass this bill or not. And if he does, he's going to have to overrule the parliamentarian. I don't know why none of them will say that. I don't know why none of them will place a share of the blame for throwing the minimum wage out of that bill on Bernie Sanders' failure to say to Chuck Schumer when it counted, I am not voting for this bill without without having the minimum wage provision in it. I'm telling you truthfully, if I were him, that's what I would have done. And nothing would have stopped me from doing it. At least, I don't think so. Of course, I haven't walked in his shoes. I'll acknowledge that. And I'm not walking in his shoes now. Kay says, thank you for another great discussion. I love you all. And we love you too, Kay. And Troy says, I'm late. I'll watch this later. Still need rest. And Carmen says, got gingerberry, kombucha, blech, kombucha, sorry. Kay says, there was a great live stream, okay, in Medicare for All today. Who was running the live stream, Kay? I probably got some notification of it, but was probably busy getting ready for the show, for this show. Carmen says, because Schmancy stays drunk. That's why, says Carmen. Carmen Muniz says, Bree Joy needs to be in high government. High government. I think She needs to learn a little bit more about the legislative process before she gets into high government. Ghostart says, Nina Turner, 15 MA abolished the filibuster. I don't know what that is. Biden wins, cheers, after sending the strongest signal yet that he's willing to play hardball. Yep. I think people are feeling happy with him now. Kay says it was on Act TV on by YouTube. Thank you, Kay. Thank you all. I'm going to say good night now. Have a good night and a good day tomorrow. I'll see you Saturday.